Here's the start of your requested introduction. The snow fell heavily in the remote wilderness, blanketing the world in an eerie silence. Thick clouds hung low over the mountains, and the occasional groan of shifting ice echoed through the valleys. Miles away from any sign of civilization, a lone hiker named Jake trudged carefully through the snow, his boots crunching softly beneath him. He had been hiking these mountains for years, but this storm was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The wind howled like a restless spirit, and visibility was nearly non-existent. Still, something deep inside compelled him to press on. Jake wasn't just any hiker. Growing up in a small town on the edge of the Rockies, he had a natural instinct for survival. The wilderness was his second home, and he prided himself on navigating even the most treacherous terrain. Today, however, was different. This wasn't just another adventure or a test of endurance. Jake felt a strange pull, a sense of urgency he couldn't explain, as if the mountains themselves were calling out for help. As he climbed higher, the sound of the wind changed. It wasn't just the storm anymore. There was something else, a faint but distinct noise carried through the gusts. A low, mournful howl. Jake stopped in his tracks, straining to hear over the roar of the blizzard. It came again, this time louder, a haunting cry that sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't the wind, it was a wolf. Most hikers would have turned back at the first sign of danger, but Jake was different. He had always felt a deep connection to wildlife, an unspoken bond that guided his actions in the wild. And while he had never seen a wolf pack this far out before, he knew enough to understand what that sound meant. It wasn't a warning. It was a cry for help. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest, as he navigated the steep incline. The snow was deeper here, and every step felt like a battle. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him trembled. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air, growing louder with every second. Jake froze, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. An avalanche. The mountains rose to life as a massive wall of snow broke loose, cascading down the slope with terrifying speed. Jake barely had time to react. He threw himself behind a cluster of rocks, pressing his body against the cold stone as the avalanche thundered past. The force of the snow was overwhelming, shaking the ground and filling the air with a deafening roar. And just as quickly as it began, it was over, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Jake emerged from his hiding spot, his heart still racing. The landscape was unrecognizable, buried under a thick layer of snow and debris. But then he heard it again, the howl. This time it was weaker, almost drowned out by the storm. Without hesitation, he followed the sound, his instincts driving him forward. After what felt like hours, he reached the source. There, half buried in the snow, was a wolf pack. The animals were tangled in the remnants of the avalanche, their fur matted with ice and their movements sluggish. Jake counted 3 of them. A massive alpha with piercing yellow eyes, a smaller wolf that looked like it might be injured, and a young pup barely old enough to stand. They were trapped, their fate sealed unless someone intervened. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he approached. The alpha bared its teeth, a low growl rumbling in its chest. But Jake didn't back away. He crouched low, speaking softly, his voice steady and calm. "I'm here to help," he said, hoping the wolves could sense his intentions. Slowly, he pulled his emergency gear from his pack, his hands trembling from the cold. The rescue was painstakingly slow. Jake worked methodically, using his tools to free the wolves from the icy grip of the snow. The alpha watched his every move, its eyes filled with both suspicion and desperation. When the last wolf was free, Jake stepped back, giving them space. For a moment, the wolves didn't move, as if they couldn't believe they had survived. Then, one by one, they stood, their legs shaky but determined. Just as Jake began to feel a sense of relief, a new sound shattered the fragile peace. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on snow. Jake turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wasn't alone. Let me know if you'd like this expanded or adjusted further. The sound of footsteps in the snow sent a chill down Jake's spine, sharper than the icy wind cutting through the trees. He held his breath, his heart pounding like a drum. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had been moving with purpose, and now it had stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional howl of the wind. Jake glanced at the wolves, their ears perked up and bodies tense, sensing the same presence he did. Jake's mind raced, replaying the events of the last hour. The avalanche, the wolves, and now this. It was almost too much to process. He had been out here dozens of times, but he had never felt this kind of unease. Something about the stillness of the wilderness felt wrong, like the mountains were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow in a rhythm that felt almost human. Jake turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out a figure through the swirling snow. But the storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He instinctively reached for the small hunting knife strapped to his belt. Not much of a weapon, but it was all he had. The wolves were alert now, their bodies low to the ground as they stared into the darkness. The alpha let out a low growl, a warning that echoed through the trees. Jake tightened his grip on the knife, his breath visible in the frigid air. He wasn't sure what to expect: a wandering hiker, a wild animal, or something else entirely. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. The words hung in the air, unanswered. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move through the storm, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The silence stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until they were gone. Jake didn't relax, though. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost. They had been watching him. He could feel it. The wolves seemed to sense the shift in his energy. The alpha stepped closer, its golden eyes meeting Jake's as if to say, "What now?" Jake didn't have an answer. His first instinct was to get out of there, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was lurking in the storm. But the wolves, they couldn't survive out here in their current state, and something told him leaving them behind would only make things worse. He turned his attention back to the pack, trying to assess their condition. The smaller wolf had a gash on its leg, and the pup was visibly shivering, its tiny body struggling to stay warm. The alpha seemed to be in better shape, but even it looked exhausted, its fur coated in frost. Jake knew they wouldn't last long without shelter. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "We've got to move." He pulled out a thermal blanket from his pack, carefully wrapping it around the pup before lifting it into his arms. The alpha growled softly, but didn't try to stop him, as if it understood he was trying to help. The other two wolves followed as Jake started moving, his boots sinking into the deep snow with every step. Jake's plan was simple: find some sort of shelter and wait out the storm. He knew of a cave about half a mile from where he was, a spot he had used in the past during sudden weather changes. It wasn't much, but it would provide enough protection to keep them alive until morning. The journey was grueling. The snow was relentless, and the cold seeped into Jake's bones despite his heavy gear. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from earlier following him. But the only shapes in the snow were the wolves, their silhouettes barely visible in the storm. By the time they reached the cave, Jake was nearly at his limit. His arms ached from carrying the pup, and his legs felt like lead. The entrance to the cave was partially obscured by snow, but he managed to clear a path, ushering the wolves inside before collapsing against the wall. The cave was small, just big enough to provide a reprieve from the wind. Jake set the pup down carefully, then worked to start a small fire using the emergency kit in his pack. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, their warmth a welcome relief from the biting cold. The wolves huddled close to the fire, their bodies visibly relaxing as the heat began to thaw their frozen fur. Jake leaned back, his eyes scanning the entrance to the cave. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even here. As the fire crackled, his thoughts drifted to the wolves. How had they ended up in the avalanche's path? Wolves were smart, usually aware of their surroundings. Something, or someone, must have driven them into danger. But why? Jake's gaze shifted to the alpha, its piercing eyes watching him from across the fire. There was something almost human in its expression, a mix of gratitude and wariness that made Jake feel like they shared an unspoken understanding. He had always respected wolves for their intelligence and strength, but this was different. This pack felt special. Just as Jake was beginning to feel a sliver of calm, a sound outside the cave shattered the moment. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable. A low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any wolf he had ever heard. The wolves immediately tensed, their ears flattening against their heads. The alpha rose to its feet, its fur bristling as it stared toward the cave's entrance. Jake's hand went to his knife again, his pulse quickening. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps. Jake moved closer to the fire, his eyes darting between the wolves and the cave entrance. He didn't know what was out there, but he could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on him like a physical force. The shadows outside the cave seemed to shift, twisting and contorting in the firelight. Jake's breath caught in his throat as a figure appeared in the entrance, a hulking silhouette that made his blood run cold. The wolves snarled, their bodies coiled like springs ready to launch. Jake tightened his grip on the knife, his mind racing as he prepared for the worst. But before he could act, the figure stepped forward, its face illuminated by the fire. What Jake saw made his stomach drop. "Would you like me to continue the story or make any adjustments?" The figure at the entrance of the cave was a man, but not the kind Jake expected to see this far from civilization. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a hood dusted with snow. The firelight reflected off the edge of a rifle slung across his back, its polished metal glinting ominously. He didn't speak right away, instead standing motionless, as if assessing the scene before him. Jake's instincts screamed danger. The man's presence didn't feel like a coincidence. He wasn't just a lost traveler. Jake glanced at the wolves, who were now snarling, their teeth bared and their bodies stiff. Even the alpha seemed uneasy, its piercing gaze locked on the stranger. The man finally stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Didn't expect to find anyone else out here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Let alone with wolves." Jake didn't lower his knife. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. The man smirked, his eyes narrowing as they flicked to the wolves. "You've got yourself some interesting company. Dangerous kind of company." "They're not hurting anyone," Jake shot back. "They were caught in an avalanche. I helped them." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "That's so. Funny thing is, wolves don't usually need rescuing. They survive just fine on their own." Jake felt his grip on the knife tighten. There was something off about this man, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man shrugged, brushing snow off his coat. "Hunting," he said simply. "Though I'd say it's more than just animals I'm after." Jake's stomach churned. The way the man said it, the casual yet deliberate tone, sent a clear message. This wasn't just about game. He was here for something specific, and Jake had the sinking feeling it had to do with the wolves. "You should move on," Jake said firmly. "There's nothing for you here." The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound that echoed in the small cave. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But these mountains don't care about guts. They chew up people like you and spit them out." Before Jake could respond, the man took a step closer, his hand resting casually on the rifle's strap. "You think you've done something noble, saving these wolves. But you don't understand what you've stepped into." The alpha growled, taking a protective stance between Jake and the man. The tension in the cave was palpable, every breath feeling heavier than the last. "What do you mean?" Jake demanded. The man tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something that looked like amusement, or perhaps malice. "Wolves like these aren't just any pack. They've been causing trouble for people around here for years. Livestock, property, even a few hikers who've gone missing. Folks are tired of it. They want them gone." Jake shook his head. "That's not their fault. They're just trying to survive, like everything else out here." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Survival doesn't justify the damage they've done. And if you keep standing in the way, you're gonna regret it." Jake's jaw clenched. He wasn't about to let this man harm the wolves, but he knew he was at a disadvantage. The man was armed, experienced, and clearly had no qualms about taking what he wanted. As the man turned to leave, he paused at the entrance, glancing back over his shoulder. "You've got until morning to make your choice," he said. "Walk away and leave them to me, or stay and deal with the consequences. Your call." And just like that, he disappeared into the storm, leaving Jake alone with the wolves and 1,000 unanswered questions. The fire crackled softly, its warmth doing little to ease the chill that had settled over the cave. Jake sat down heavily, his mind racing. Who was that man? Why was he so determined to kill the wolves? And what did he mean about them causing trouble? The Alpha approached, its golden eyes fixed on Jake. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had brought this danger to them by intervening, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. As the storm raged outside, Jake tried to piece together what little he knew. The wolves weren't ordinary, that much was clear. But was the man's story true? Had they really been attacking people, or was there something else going on? Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside the cave made Jake's heart race, and his thoughts kept circling back to the man's parting words. He knew he couldn't just leave the wolves behind, not when they were vulnerable, but staying meant putting himself directly in harm's way. The wolves didn't seem to rest either. They remained alert, their ears twitching at every distant sound. The Alpha stayed close to the pup, occasionally nudging it with its nose to keep it warm. Jake watched them, marveling at their resilience. Despite everything, they were still fighting to survive. As the hours dragged on, the storm began to ease, the wind dying down to a faint whisper. But the quiet only made Jake more uneasy. He knew the man would be back, and this time, he wouldn't come alone. Jake stood, pacing the small space as he tried to come up with a plan. He had no weapons besides his knife, and no way to contact help. His best bet was to move the wolves before morning. But where could they go? The mountains were vast, and the wolves were already weakened. The Alpha watched him closely, its eyes following his every movement. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it understood more than it let on, as if it knew the stakes just as well as he did. Finally, Jake crouched down, meeting the Alpha's gaze. "We're in this together now," he said softly. "I don't know what's out there, but I'm not leaving you behind." The Alpha didn't react, but Jake felt a strange sense of reassurance. Whatever happened next, he wasn't facing it alone. As the first hints of dawn began to creep into the sky, the wolves stirred, their bodies tense with anticipation. Jake gathered his things, his mind made up. They couldn't stay here, not if they wanted to survive. But as he stepped toward the cave entrance, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable, the distant echo of voices carried on the wind. They were coming. "Would you like me to continue or adjust any part of the story so far?" The voices carried through the icy morning air, faint at first, but growing clearer with every passing moment. Jake's heart sank. The man hadn't been bluffing. He had returned, and he wasn't alone. Jake crouched low near the entrance of the cave, peering through the narrow opening. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stark, frozen landscape bathed in the pale light of dawn. Shadows moved across the snow in the distance. Several figures, their shapes blurred but unmistakable. The wolves sensed the approaching danger. The alpha's ears were pinned back, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. The smaller wolf limped closer to the pup, nudging it protectively as if to shield it from whatever was coming. Jake felt a pang of helplessness. He had no way to defend them. His small hunting knife seemed laughably inadequate against rifles and numbers. The voices became clearer now, rough and purposeful. Jake could make out snippets of their conversation as they trudged through the snow. "Tracks lead this way," one of them said. "They're holed up somewhere close." "Better be worth it," another muttered. "Spent all night out here for a handful of wolves." "They're worth more than you think," the first man replied, his tone sharp. "Especially the alpha. We bring them in, and we're set for the season." Jake's stomach churned. These men weren't just hunters. They were after the wolves for some twisted reason, and the way they spoke about the alpha made Jake's skin crawl. He couldn't let them get their hands on the pack, but how could he stop them? He turned to the wolves, his mind racing. They were trapped in this cave with nowhere to run. Even if they tried to flee, their tracks would lead the men straight to them. The wolves were exhausted, injured, and completely vulnerable. Jake knew he had to do something, but every option seemed like a dead end. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder. Jake's pulse quickened as he saw the men come into view. There were 4 of them, each armed and dressed in heavy coats. The man from the night before led the group, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a smug expression on his face. He stopped just a few yards from the cave, scanning the area with sharp, calculating eyes. "They're here," he said confidently, nodding toward the tracks leading up to the cave. "Get ready." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He knew he couldn't stay hidden much longer. The men were too close, and the cave offered no real cover. If he didn't act now, the wolves would be at their mercy. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped out of the cave, his hands raised to show he wasn't holding a weapon. The men froze, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of him. "Stay back," Jake said firmly, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You don't need to do this." The leader smirked, his grip tightening on his rifle. "You again. I figured you'd be smart enough to walk away." "I'm not letting you hurt them," Jake replied, his tone steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The man chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "And how do you plan to stop us? With that little knife of yours? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and way out of your depth." Jake didn't flinch. "They're not what you think," he said, his mind scrambling for a way to buy time. "These wolves didn't attack anyone. They're just trying to survive." One of the other men scoffed. "Save the speech, hero. Wolves are wolves. They're dangerous, and they don't belong near people." Jake shook his head, his frustration mounting. "You don't understand. These wolves aren't just animals. They're part of this place. If you kill them, you'll destroy something you don't even realize is important." The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "Enough talk," he said, gesturing to the others. "Get them out of the cave, and if he tries to stop you, shoot him." The men began to move forward, their boots crunching through the snow with chilling precision. Jake's mind raced as he stepped back toward the cave. He couldn't let them reach the wolves, but he didn't know how to stop them. Inside the cave, the wolves were on high alert, their eyes glowing in the dim light. The alpha stood at the entrance, its body coiled like a spring, ready to defend its pack. Jake felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as he looked at the alpha. They were in this together now, for better or worse. As the first man approached the cave, Jake acted on instinct. He grabbed a handful of snow and hurled it at the man's face, catching him off guard. The man stumbled back, cursing, and Jake used the distraction to position himself in front of the cave entrance, his knife held tightly in his hand. "You're making a mistake," Jake warned, his voice firm. The leader laughed, shaking his head. "No, kid. The mistake was thinking you could stand in our way." Before Jake could respond, a deafening howl pierced the air. It was the Alpha, its voice echoing through the mountains like a battle cry. The sound was so powerful, so commanding, that even the men hesitated, glancing at each other uneasily. And then, from the trees, shadows began to emerge. Jake's eyes widened as more wolves appeared, their forms moving silently through the snow. They came from every direction, their numbers far greater than Jake had ever imagined. The men froze, their bravado evaporating as they realized they were surrounded. The Alpha stepped forward, its golden eyes burning with determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a fight for their territory, their family, their lives. The men raised their rifles, their hands trembling. Jake braced himself, his heart pounding as the tension reached its breaking point. The wolves stood their ground, their growls filling the air like the rumble of distant thunder. And then the leader barked an order, and chaos erupted. Let me know if you'd like the story to continue or need adjustments to any part. The air exploded with motion and sound as the men fired their rifles, the shots cracking through the icy dawn. Wolves darted in every direction, their sleek bodies blending with the snow as they moved with precision and instinct. Jake dropped low, barely avoiding a stray bullet that ricocheted off the rocky cave wall behind him. The Alpha charged forward, a blur of muscle and fur, its fierce growl rising above the chaos. Jake's heart thundered in his chest as he tried to take stock of the situation. The wolves were fighting back with a ferocity that stunned the hunters. The pack wasn't just scattered animals fleeing for safety. They were coordinated, protecting one another and working as a unit. The smaller wolf stayed behind, shielding the injured pup while the others engaged the attackers. The leader shouted over the chaos, barking orders to his men. "Don't let them surround us. Aim for the Alpha." His voice was sharp, but Jake caught the slightest edge of panic. Jake didn't think. He threw himself toward the nearest hunter, grabbing for the rifle slung across the man's shoulder. The man struggled, his grip strong, but Jake's desperation gave him an edge. With a hard pull, he wrenched the weapon free and tossed it into the snow, out of reach. "Stay down," Jake shouted, trying to make himself heard over the snarls and gunfire. The hunter snarled back, swinging a fist that caught Jake on the side of his face. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He lunged again, this time shoving the man off balance and sending him sprawling into the snow. Before Jake could catch his breath, he felt a rush of air, and the Alpha was beside him, its golden eyes locked on the fallen hunter. For a split second, Jake thought the wolf might attack, but instead, it stood protectively at his side, its presence both reassuring and terrifying. One of the other hunters screamed as a wolf lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The man scrambled to his feet, his rifle forgotten in the snow. The wolves were relentless, their movements precise and purposeful. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were sending a message. Jake glanced at the leader, who had retreated a few steps, his rifle still raised. His eyes darted between the wolves and his men, calculating his next move. He looked less confident now, the smirk replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. "You've made a big mistake, kid," he growled, aiming the rifle at Jake. But before he could pull the trigger, a sound cut through the chaos. A deep, resonant howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. It wasn't from the Alpha or any of the wolves already in the fight. It came from somewhere beyond the trees, distant yet powerful, carrying with it an undeniable sense of authority. Everyone froze. The hunters, the wolves, even Jake, all of them turned toward the sound. The leader's face paled, his grip on the rifle faltering for the first time. "What the hell was that?" One of the hunters muttered, his voice trembling. The Alpha lifted its head, its ears perked toward the direction of the howl. There was a glimmer of recognition in its eyes, as if it knew exactly who, or what, was coming. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. The tension in the air shifted, growing heavier, more electric. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just another wolf. Moments later, the trees rustled, and a massive figure emerged from the shadows. It was another wolf, but unlike any Jake had ever seen. It was larger than the alpha, its fur a mix of silver and black that shimmered in the early light. Its eyes burned with an intensity that made even the most seasoned hunters take a step back. The alpha let out a low whine, dipping its head slightly in what looked like deference. The new wolf stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The pack seemed to rally around it, their snarls fading as they took their cues from the newcomer. Jake could feel the shift in the dynamic. This wasn't just a wolf, it was a leader, a guardian, something ancient and powerful. The hunters seemed to sense it too, their bravado crumbling under the weight of the wolf's presence. The leader of the hunters gritted his teeth, raising his rifle again. "I don't care how big it is," he spat. "A wolf is still just a wolf." Jake saw the wolf's eyes narrow, its body tensing like a coiled spring. He knew it was coming before it happened. "Don't!" Jake started to shout, but it was too late. The massive wolf launched itself at the hunter, moving with a speed and precision that defied its size. The leader fired, but the shot went wide as the wolf knocked him to the ground, pinning him with its immense weight. The other hunters scrambled, some dropping their weapons and running, others frozen in fear. The pack surged forward, driving the men back and reclaiming the space around the cave. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. The massive wolf didn't kill the leader, but it didn't let him go either. It stood over him, its teeth bared, and a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. The leader's rifle lay just out of reach, buried in the snow. His face was pale, his confidence completely shattered. Jake felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, fear, awe. He didn't know what this wolf was or where it had come from, but it had turned the tide in a way he hadn't thought possible. As the pack regrouped, the massive wolf let out another howl, this one softer but no less commanding. The alpha stepped forward, standing side by side with the newcomer. Together, they looked down at the leader, their message unmistakable: leave and never return. Jake took a cautious step forward, his voice steady but quiet. "It's over," he said, addressing the hunters. "Leave now, and no one else gets hurt." The men didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled away, their retreat clumsy and desperate. The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his fear, but in the end, he followed, throwing one last hateful glance over his shoulder. As the hunters disappeared into the trees, the wolves relaxed slightly, their growls fading. Jake let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with adrenaline. But as he turned to the alpha, he saw something that stopped him cold. The massive wolf was staring at him now, its intense gaze unyielding. It stepped closer, its movements deliberate, and Jake realized with a sinking feeling that the fight might not be over after all. "Would you like me to continue?" The massive wolf's eyes bore into Jake's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The wind, the retreating hunters, even the alpha and the rest of the pack, it all disappeared, leaving only Jake and this towering creature in a silent standoff. Jake's chest tightened as he tried to decipher the wolf's intentions. It wasn't attacking, but there was something in its gaze, something Jake couldn't quite place. The alpha stepped forward, breaking the spell. It let out a low, almost questioning growl, its eyes flicking between Jake and the larger wolf. The interaction between them was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jake could sense an understanding pass between the two. The alpha seemed to relax slightly, its posture less defensive, as if it trusted the larger wolf to take the lead. Jake exhaled slowly, his body still tense, but his instincts urging him to hold his ground. He didn't dare make any sudden moves. The massive wolf tilted its head, studying him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. Jake had the unsettling feeling that it wasn't just looking at him. It was evaluating him, weighing his actions and his intentions. The injured pup whimpered from the back of the cave, breaking the tension. The sound was faint, but it seemed to draw the massive wolf's attention. It turned and padded toward the pup, its movements slow and deliberate. The other wolves parted to let it through, their respect for this newcomer evident in their deference. Jake watched as the massive wolf leaned down, sniffing the pup gently. The pup responded with a tentative wag of its tail, its fear melting into trust. The smaller injured wolf limped closer, nudging the pup toward the larger wolf, as if recognizing it as a protector. It was then that Jake realized the truth. This wasn't just another wolf from the pack. This was the pack's leader, the true alpha, the one they had been waiting for. The howls, the coordinated defense, the deference of the other wolves. It all made sense now. This wolf wasn't just part of the pack. It was their heart, their guiding force. But as the larger wolf tended to the pup, Jake noticed something strange. Its movements were slower than he would have expected for a creature of its size and power. When it turned slightly, he saw a faint but distinct mark on its side, a scar, long and jagged, as if it had survived something most wouldn't. The realization hit Jake like a bolt of lightning. This wolf had been through its own battles, its own struggles for survival. It wasn't just leading the pack, it was carrying their collective pain and resilience. Jake took a cautious step forward, his voice soft but steady. "You've been protecting them all along, haven't you?" he said, more to himself than the wolf. The massive wolf turned its head, its piercing eyes meeting Jake's again. There was no aggression in its gaze now, only a profound depth that made Jake feel small in the presence of something far greater than himself. Before Jake could process what was happening, the wolf stepped closer to him, its massive frame towering over him. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. But instead of attacking, the wolf lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging him. The gesture was brief, but it carried a weight Jake couldn't fully comprehend. He felt an odd sense of connection, as though the wolf had recognized his efforts to protect the pack, even when the odds were stacked against him. The moment was interrupted by a distant sound, a low rumble that Jake initially mistook for the wind. But as it grew louder, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He turned toward the source, his stomach sinking as he realized what it was. Another avalanche. The snow on the distant peaks was shifting, cascading down with a force that sent plumes of white into the air. It was headed straight for them. Jake's heart raced as he turned back to the wolves. The massive wolf let out a sharp, commanding bark, and the pack sprang into action. They didn't panic. Instead, they moved with purpose, following the larger wolf as it led them toward higher ground. Jake hesitated for only a moment before running after them. The snow was already shifting around his feet, the force of the avalanche pulling everything in its path. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning as he tried to keep up with the wolves. The pack reached a narrow ledge, the only safe haven in sight. The massive wolf stood at the edge, barking orders to the others as they scrambled to safety. Jake climbed up behind them, his hands slipping on the icy rock, but he refused to give up. As the last wolf made it to safety, the massive wolf turned to face the oncoming avalanche. For a split second, Jake thought it was going to stand its ground, but then it let out one final powerful howl that seemed to echo through the mountains. "Would you like me to continue?" The massive wolf's eyes bore into Jake's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The wind, the retreating hunters, even the alpha and the rest of the pack, it all disappeared, leaving only Jake and this towering creature in a silent standoff. Jake's chest tightened as he tried to decipher the wolf's intentions. It wasn't attacking, but there was something in its gaze, something Jake couldn't quite place. The snow rode past them, its force shaking the ledge and threatening to sweep them away. Jake clung to the rock, his heart pounding as he watched the avalanche finally lose momentum, the snow settling into an eerie silence. When it was over, the wolves began to regroup, their breaths visible in the cold air. The massive wolf stood at the center, its presence commanding even in the aftermath of such chaos. But just as Jake thought they were safe, the ground beneath them shifted again. This time, it wasn't snow. It was the ledge itself. The wolves reacted instantly, their instincts driving them to leap to another, more stable outcrop. Jake scrambled after them, but the unstable ledge gave way beneath his feet. He slipped, his fingers grasping at the edge as he dangled precariously above the snowy abyss. The alpha turned back, its golden eyes wide with alarm. It barked urgently, but the massive wolf was already moving. It lunged forward, its powerful jaws clamping onto Jake's jacket and pulling him back to safety with a strength that left him breathless. Jake lay on the ground, his chest heaving as he looked up at the wolf that had saved his life. The massive wolf stood over him, its eyes burning with a mix of intensity and something Jake could only describe as understanding. In that moment, Jake knew he wasn't just dealing with animals. These wolves, especially the massive one, were something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. As the pack began to move again, Jake followed, his mind racing with everything he had just witnessed. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. As Jake followed the wolves down the winding path away from the unstable ledge, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. The fear of the avalanche, the strange connection he had formed with the wolves, and the sheer improbability of what had happened all swirled in his mind. The massive wolf, the true alpha, walked at the head of the pack with an air of quiet authority. It would glance back at him now and then, as if ensuring he kept pace, but otherwise, it remained focused on leading its family to safety. The path narrowed as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The fresh snow gleamed in the dim light, making the forest around them seem otherworldly. Jake's legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. There was something about this journey, something unfinished, that compelled him forward. The wolves had saved him, and now he felt a strange responsibility to see their safety through to the end. Finally, after what felt like hours, the wolves stopped at a secluded clearing. It was a sheltered spot, surrounded by towering pines that had been spared the worst of the avalanche's wrath. The pack began to settle in, tending to their injured and regrouping after the harrowing ordeal. The massive wolf stood watch, its eyes scanning the surroundings with unwavering focus. Jake leaned against a tree, his breath visible in the cold air. His body ached, but his mind was restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something far greater than himself, something ancient and untamed. The bond between the wolves, their resilience, their unspoken communication. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. And at the center of it all was the massive wolf, a creature that seemed to embody both strength and wisdom. He watched as the wolves gathered around the injured pup. The alpha nudged it gently, while the others formed a protective circle. The pup whimpered softly, but it was clear it was in good hands, or paws, rather. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the pack's loyalty and unity. Despite everything they had been through, they remained a family, bound by something unbreakable. The massive wolf approached him then, its golden eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem almost luminous. Jake held his breath as the wolf stopped just a few feet away, its gaze locked onto his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. Jake felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if the wolf was telling him something without words. "You're incredible," Jake said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you." The wolf tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging his words. Then it turned and rejoined the pack, its presence commanding but gentle. Jake felt a pang of sadness as he realized his time with them was coming to an end. He didn't belong in their world, and they didn't belong in his. But the connection they had formed would stay with him forever. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Jake knew it was time to leave. The wolves had found safety, and there was nothing more he could do for them. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle the pack. The alpha watched him with a calm expression, its eyes conveying a sense of gratitude, or perhaps farewell. "Take care of them," Jake said, his voice tinged with emotion. "You're an amazing leader." He turned and began making his way back toward the trailhead, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The forest was quiet now, the chaos of the previous night replaced by a serene stillness. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the massive wolf standing at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette framed by the rising sun. It didn't follow him, but it didn't look away either. Jake raised a hand in a silent gesture of goodbye, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the wolf mode in return. The journey back to civilization was long and uneventful, giving Jake plenty of time to reflect on everything that had happened. The hunters, the avalanche, the pack's remarkable bond. It all felt surreal, like a story he might have heard from someone else rather than something he had lived. Yet, the aches in his body and the memories burned into his mind reminded him that it was all very real. When Jake finally reached the trailhead, he was greeted by a search and rescue team that had been looking for him since the storm hit. They were astonished to find him alive, and even more so when he recounted his tale. Though he left out certain details, unsure if anyone would believe him. The part about the wolves, however, he couldn't hide. Their role in his survival was undeniable, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude toward them. As he sat in the rescue vehicle, wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping hot coffee, Jake couldn't help but wonder what would become of the pack. He knew they were resilient, but the wilderness was unpredictable. Still, if there was one thing he had learned, it was that the wolves were far stronger and more resourceful than anyone gave them credit for. They would survive, they always had. Back in town, Jake's story quickly spread, sparking curiosity and disbelief in equal measure. Some dismissed it as an exaggerated tale of survival, while others saw it as a testament to the wild beauty and power of nature. For Jake, it didn't matter what others thought. He knew the truth, and that was enough. In the days that followed, Jake found himself drawn to the mountains again and again. He didn't venture too far, respecting the wolves' territory, but he often hiked to a vantage point where he could look out over the vast wilderness. Sometimes, he thought he heard distant howls carried on the wind, a hauntingly beautiful reminder of the pack that had changed his life. One morning, as he stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, he saw a single figure emerge from the trees far below. It was the massive wolf, its silver and black coat shimmering in the sunlight. It stood there for a moment, looking up at him, before turning and disappearing back into the forest. Jake smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. The wolves had their world, and he had his, but for a brief, extraordinary moment, their paths had crossed. Jake knew he would never forget what he had learned from them: the strength of unity, the power of trust, and the unbreakable spirit of the wild. As he turned to head back down the trail, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mountains had taught him something he would carry with him forever, and he knew he was better for it. The pack was safe, the wilderness still wild, and Jake's heart forever changed.